I think emotional development is something that is not taken very seriously in a lot of cultures, I would say, in a lot of families, because there's very less awareness when it comes to these things.
Let's Talk DXB. Real conversations by real people. Anuja, thank you so much for coming into Let's Talk DXB.
You're most welcome.
Really appreciate it. I think anyone that gives time to this, I'm very grateful, because you're obviously a very busy lady. So obviously you'd come across the very first podcast, which would have been about my divorce.
Yes.
Even saying that, I was like, I can't believe I released that. And then we got talking. This is the first time we're meeting in person.
Yes, and it's lovely.
Thank you. And it was a blessing, because I went to my therapy session on the Tuesday and we spoke on the Wednesday.
Oh.
And in therapy, I always talk about my son, because that's my trigger. You know, when you've gone through separation, you always worry about your child. You know, is he okay? I mean, I chose to file for divorce, and you get that narrative of, if you break your marriage when there's a child, the child could be disturbed, broken home. So many different, external voices is what I heard. So I was very mindful of, even for me, the trauma of separating from my husband. And I couldn't ignore that there is a child involved. Speaking about all of that in my therapy session. And then we spoke on Wednesday. And then you said you are a child psychologist.
Yes.
And I was like, what? This was literally a blessing from God, because I'm so keen to learn more about how children express their emotions. If there is something that maybe is traumatic for them, how do parents or the caregiver, how do they take notice of these things as well? So it was just fantastic that you agreed to come and speak to me today, because there's so much more that I would like to be aware of as a very intentional mother.
Yes.
And here we are. Yes. So I wanted to first learn, I always like to learn about people and about their background. So Anuja, tell me more about you, where your passion for working with children came from. That would be fantastic.
All right. So I think you've already spoken about the initial bit. So I am Anuja, working with special needs children.
Okay.
I decided to pursue my career as a psychologist. And where it came from, it's a funny story. So I have an educational background in psychology all throughout. So I had it as a subject in school, and that's where I developed this interest in the subject, and I wanted to learn more and I wanted to study more. So I did my bachelor's. And after my bachelor's, I happened to do 2 internship programs.
Okay.
And at that time, I realized that I think my passion lies in working with children. And I immensely enjoyed it. And I think that is my true calling, just being around children, just goofing around with them even. So it's not always very serious, or it's not always something that, I have to always have my antennas up and look out for why the child is doing this and why is he or she behaving in this way. No, I think it's more important to build that connection with the child, to make the child feel safe, comfortable, build that rapport with them wherein, they feel that they are in a safe environment and they can trust this adult. So those were a lot of new things that I identified about myself.
Fantastic.
And I had that self-awareness, and I knew since then that this is where I want to build my career. And my passion lied there. So I ventured on to pursue my master's. I did that from University of Leeds in England. It was a great experience. But I wanted to come back to Dubai. Dubai had been home for me for the past 17 years at the time. So I was missing Dubai basically because, as you would know, the life in Dubai versus the life in England.
Who would have missed Dubai?
And just how we were earlier discussing about how different lives are in these 2 countries. I think I wanted to come back.
I don't blame you.
So I came back and I explored. Obviously, at that time, I was still very new to the field, and I was learning how to have a footing in this field. That took a while because you have to go through a lot of procedures and you have to sit through an exam. And once I was licensed, I started my journey as a psychologist. Obviously, initially, it was hard because, like I said, you had a lot to learn from. And I did that, and I think ever since, there's no looking back.
Fantastic. I love how I can tell you're passionate about it. And when we spoke before, I think it's so important when you can find what your passion is and your purpose and then pursue it. That's, it resonates so well. I think it's so important. So for me, I mean, another kind of big thing and what I was excited to speak to you about is definitely in terms of kind of observing a child's emotions, good or bad, or how they express themselves. Like, you know, I have a 3-year-old son, as you know, and I'm very big on making sure that he feels comfortable to be able to express when he's happy, when he's sad. The language used, I hate, in my personal opinion, when they say, oh, boys don't cry, big boys don't cry, you're a big boy. I think it suppresses so much, like you're telling them it's not okay to feel sad or to show mummy that you're sad. So what are some of the kind of factors that caregivers or parents need to really think about when, you know, 3-year-old, I think from the age of 3, it's such an important stage of children building their emotional intelligence and being able to express. So what are some of the things that caregivers need to really think about with their children from such a young age?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Sharon, and a lot of people don't talk about it because I would like to shed some light on emotional development in children. Yeah. So just like how you would see a child developing physically, you can see it. It's something observable, tangible. You can see a child grow bigger. Yeah. They crawl, they start, walking, taking smaller steps, bigger steps. So all of these things that you can see externally are easier for us to understand. Yeah. As opposed to, let's say, emotional and social development, which might not necessarily be externally observable. So just like how I was talking about physical development, language development is also such that, you can hear the sounds that the child is making. If there is any delays or if you feel that there is something not going in the right manner, you can always identify. But that doesn't quite happen with emotional development. However, the trajectory is the same. Okay. So just like how we have, physical development milestones, language development milestones, we have emotional development milestones as well. And the way you would see that is also observable if you pay attention and if you have that awareness and knowledge. So, as an infant, the first need of that child is to connect with a caregiver. And the way in which they connect would be, looking at you or crying, asking for your comfort, asking to be soothed, asking to be fed. So all of these things, and sometimes what happens is some babies are not able to do very well with these emotional development milestones. Yep. They might not be self-aware. So even things like, hunger or thirst or crying because they need to see their mom or dad or their primary caregivers is not something that comes to them naturally. Right. Okay. And that can then later on manifest as some emotional disturbances, challenges in the way they connect with their society, with other individuals as they grow up, maybe their siblings, maybe their extended family members. So I think emotional development is something that is not taken very seriously in a lot of cultures, I would say, in a lot of families, because there's very less awareness when it comes to these things. Yep. And also education, I think, plays a very important part. So a lot of curriculums, they would not focus on emotions, right? Although now I'm seeing the trends change. There are, teachers who are teaching children about feelings and emotions. And
at quite a young age as well. I think my son's nursery very much, they do that actually, which is very impressive. Yeah.
So that is, I can see that shift and that change in the way early childhood educators are approaching children. However, there's a lot that caregivers can do, and caregivers can learn as well from professionals. And obviously, there's a lot of knowledge out there on the internet now. So a few things I think that you can be mindful of as a parent or as a primary caregiver is to be attentive to your child's needs. Okay. And the way in which you can do that is by listening to your child, by observing your child's behavior. And it also comes with a lot of acceptance. So rather than trying to fit that child in a box or trying for that child that, these are my expectations or my goals or my priorities for my child, put that aside and just see the child for who they are. So, because it's very important for us to see a child very respectfully rather than trying to see them as, a helpless being who needs to be instructed, who needs to be controlled. I mean, those days are gone. And we need to have, that autonomy that needs to be given to children because that is what shapes their character. That is what shapes their personality. And that is what gives them that self-esteem and that self-confidence to deal with life in a better way. So I think as caregivers, it's very, very important to listen to your child, to validate their feelings. And that is something that you would have heard of even in adulthood, that, in relationships, any sort of a relationship, be it a professional relationship or a personal relationship, it's very important to listen to the other person.
So true.
And it's the same for children. You need to acknowledge their feelings. You need to validate and reassure them so that they grow up into becoming more secure individuals. They feel safe. They feel trusted. They are able to trust other people as well. Obviously, life is going to throw a lot at you, and we know that
as
best.
We know.
But I think the ultimate aim should be to prepare a child for this rather than trying to shield them or protect them or trying to say that, oh, this doesn't happen, or, trying to diminish or minimize their experiences, especially the difficult ones. Because the easy ones, it's all roses.
Everything's great.
But the difficult ones are that need support. And if you are a parent who's sensitive and responsive towards your child's needs, be it any sort of a difficult experience, if you're supportive, if you inculcate that from an early age that, I'm your safe zone or I'm your safe environment, then the child will always grow up to have that kind of an attitude towards life, towards their external environments. And that will then have an impact on their internal emotions and internal world as well. So any sort of difficult phase in life or a conflict or something that is bitter and unwanted, maladaptive, they will be able to navigate through it. Or they might be able to reach out to the right person, because we don't expect a 7-year-old to have a conversation like you and I are having. Or they might not be able to go to a therapist just the way an adult can, or access resources just the way we can. But they look out for a model. They look out for someone who can guide them, who can be their, their support, their shoulder to cry on. Someone who can accept them non-judgmentally. So I think if we can strive to becoming that adult, that individual in their lives, they will be better prepared for their future.
Literally, everything you've said is like, because I know maybe in my culture, so West African, it's very much you do as you're told, basically. Do as your parents say. Don't be perceived as being disrespectful. And I agree with that. I'm raising a child that I want him to be respectful of others. I want him to be able to be in an environment where he accepts that everyone has their opinion, etc. But finding a balance, particularly when I have like olders looking at me thinking, you're way too patient. Or, why are you so communicative with your son? I love asking, how is your day? We have conversations, and I'm thankful that he articulates himself well for his age, and he's very expressive. But I know there's people that are looking at me like, Sharon, you're treating him like he's an adult. But it's not, I'm treating him like he's an adult. I want his feelings, I want him to feel safe enough to express himself. And if he is having a bad day, luckily I don't have tantrums from my son. For some reason, I've been very fortunate. He's quite a mellow child. But if he doesn't want to do something, I'm mindful not to force him, depending on what that is. Obviously, he needs to be safe. And I it's my responsibility to say when it's, no, that's not sensible. But I will hear him out. Why do you not want to eat this now? Not like eat, or you go to bed hungry, or, it can get quite an aggressive situation if you're not patient. And most of the times when I do that, he follows what I want him to do. But I think it's just knowing that he's validated, and even at a young age, he should be able to tell me why his no is no before me forcing him into something. So I feel like that's finding a balance is hard because you have the cultural dynamic.
Yes.
And then I'm also very mindful that I want him to feel safe and that he can come to me and tell me when there's a problem or tell me when he's overexcited and happy.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you're kind of validating my parenting style. Yeah, I'm working on it.
No, of course. And I think a few things that you've said, I would like to touch upon them just to elaborate from a psychology perspective. Two things that came to my mind when you were mentioning the balance. One is obviously parenting styles and the kind of attachment that you have with your child, because these are theoretically oriented schools of thought and very much research evidence that have an impact on your personality, on your behavior. So definitely we do talk about parenting styles and how they can impact a child's behavior and their behavior in compliance to their parenting styles that they are introduced towards. And another thing that we must look into is the temperament of the child.
Right.
So just like how we talk about adult personalities, in terms of children, we use the word temperament.
Right.
And like you mentioned about your boy, that, you know, he seems like an easygoing child who would listen to instructions or would comply with demands. So there are three broad categories that we categorize children into. One would be this one with your boy, who would be an easy and flexible kind of a temperamental child who would listen to their adults, who would be easygoing in life, who would be adaptive to different environments, easily adapting to different situations. So you're lucky.
I see that in him because even through this divorce, I say that, and I don't want to say that to be like, oh yeah, he's fine. Of course, he's aware that his dad is not in the home. His dad doesn't live in this country. But I was surprised of what I believe of how well he has adapted to our new norm. It's me, if anything, I'm like, oh my gosh. Yeah. But I think that resonates with that type of personality. Okay.
Yeah. And this is something that is innate. So the biological makeup that we say.
Really?
And the genetics that come into play, because it's always about nature versus nurture. And I highly believe in that because, you know, you do come into this life with a set of blueprint. And that kind of dictates how you turn out to be. And then there is an external influence on your behavior with your interactions with people, your social environment, and so many other factors. So coming back to the temperamental aspect. So yes, that's one category. The second category is the difficult one, which is children who are active and feisty.
Ooh.
So, you know, I'd say my childhood was like that.
So, how would I deal with a child like that?
You need to have a lot of resilience. I'd give all credit to my parents.
To your parents now.
So that's the group of children who would, you know, really test you. And who would push you to your limits because I wouldn't say intentionally, but that's just how they are. That's just how their personality is. So, you know, they would be irritable, for example. They would be moody. They would have irregular cycles of, let's say, appetite and sleep. So a lot of times parents talk about fussy eaters or children, you know, who don't sleep on time or maybe get up in the middle of the night and they want to play and they're hyperactive. So yes, there's a lot of factors that we need to consider as a psychologist, but one underlying factor would be that's just how the child's personality is designed. And that's how they will be in different situations. So yes, as a psychologist or as a professional who's working with children, it's very important for us to have that clinical interview with the parents to come to a conclusion. Whether it's related to a personality issue or it's related to something else. So that would be one category of your personality.
Interesting.
And then the third one would be wherein the child needs some time to warm up. They are cautious. So, you know, they might come across as shy. They might come across as someone who avoids social interactions. They could be submissive. They could be extremely compliant. And that could also be a problem because they don't understand stranger danger, for example. So, they could easily be influenced by anybody because they don't have that solid, grounding in this is right and this is wrong, and morality, and making the right decision, taking care of their safety. So that is the third category. So I would say each category comes with its own ups and downs, and we need to be better equipped as parents, caregivers, childhood educators in how to manage these different temperaments.
It's so interesting because there's so many different dynamics and they're small. And I feel like with children, it's very easy to dismiss them when they're tiny. Oh, they're small, they don't know. And this is a narrative I had even through now, having this conversation with you. There's definitely probably people like, why? And I've seen your son, he's fine, he's happy, and thank God he is. But I still need to be mindful of he's growing, he's learning. If I'm finding the change in life difficult and the separation of having the father in the house, I can't ignore that might not impact him. He's not showing that. But I think it's so important as a parent to be more mindful of how smart these little beings are. I'm shocked every day of how much my son absorbs and how aware he is of situations. And thank goodness, how much he vocalizes. So I feel like this has helped me to be like, no, I can't just ignore and say he's fine. So I wanted to also get an idea about when trauma happens. Obviously, there's different types of trauma. I filed for divorce. A lot of the narrative was stay for your child, stay in your marriage for your child, because otherwise it's going to mess up your child. I felt like it's better for myself and my son and probably my husband, my ex-husband maybe, to be in a loving, healthy environment. Now, our marriage wasn't toxic. No one was screaming. There wasn't, physical abuse. There was obviously, it transpired that there was infidelity in the marriage. And I just didn't want that to be seen as the norm for my child. And again, he was very small. So a lot of people would be like, well, he won't know any different, work through it, stay for him. Leaving the narrative as what I got is he's going to be messed up. You've messed up his life. So I had a lot of guilt around that. But how does a parent identify if there is trauma with that child? Not because of divorce, there could be so many other factors. Are there clear triggers, or you just have to keep observing behavior changes?
So like you rightly said, there can be a number of ways in which we can identify, and there are quite a lot of ways I can discuss and take you through some of them that will be helpful. So yes, any sort of a change in the family systems. So dysfunctional families are something that we see with certain children where, like you said, thankfully in your marriage that wasn't the case. But yeah, there are children who are exposed to difficult parents. So there are regular disputes which could be explosive in nature. There could be screaming and shouting, and that's not a healthy way to manage your emotions, right? And if a child is seeing that, and they are in their mind making sense of it as the normal, then you can imagine what impact it would have on this child's mental health later on in life. And that's what typically happens if it's not addressed in that time. So yes, family does play a very important role, and the family environment that you're providing to your child. So any sort of a dysfunction in the family, any sort of instability as well. So yes, there are a lot of children who go through parent separation, divorce, which can be difficult, and sometimes they're smooth. So for example, in your case, I assume that it was a smooth process. Mom and dad were both amicably ready for the divorce. So it did not get ugly, but at the same time, the child needs to make sense of that situation.
That's the thing.
They need to understand that once, I was living with both mom and dad, and now I'm only living with mom or only living with dad, whatever the situation might be, because in their mind, it was mom and dad who were there. And now suddenly there's a change. So, we have to look out for any sort of an instability. There can be numerous instabilities that can take place. There are financial instabilities that children might go through, and especially during the COVID times, children had to undergo situations where parents would lose their job and they would have to go back to their home country overnight, or just be stuck in another country with not having enough financials to support each other and have, the family life that they used to have prior to the pandemic. So that is something that can cause a lot of stress in children as well. Then obviously there are other precursors that we look out for. One thing that as a clinician I would look out for, and I would ask parents and whoever are the primary caregivers, is for any sort of a sudden behavioral change. So anything that happens out of the normal suddenly is something that is we have to take note of, and it's something that can indicate towards repressed feelings or chronic stress, because a child does have resiliency. They will try to cope with it in their own way, but one fine day, it will just come out in a way that we wouldn't have assumed, or we wouldn't have predicted. So that is something, anything that happens suddenly is so in my experience, I would have seen children suddenly having gone through bedwetting phases. So, even if they're toilet trained and, they have good control over their bowels, but, suddenly they're wetting their beds, or suddenly they're socially withdrawing. So activities that would bring them pleasure and that were of their interest are suddenly not pleasurable for them anymore. So they begin to socially withdraw. They don't want to play with the same toys anymore. They don't want to play with the same peers or friends anymore. They don't want to go to school. And these are all things that earlier they would enjoy. They would take pleasure in. But now they don't seem to be interesting and motivating for them. So that could be something that needs to be further investigated, that why is the child behaving in this way? Then we oftentimes talk about the term anxiety. But I think it's a very broad term, and we need to understand the specifics of the word anxiety, because it can be categorized into various dimensions. So there is something called as anxiety when you are unclear of what's happening. So maybe you see that the child is being restless. Their attention levels are affected. So maybe if a child who was able to stay engaged in an activity of their interest, or a preferred game, or a preferred task, and they were, let's say, able to sit with it for 10 to 15 minutes, now they are not able to stay engaged for more than 2 or 3 minutes. They're irritable. They are, getting moody, or they're just worried all the time, and they're coming to their mom and dad and, just showing signs of worry. They want to, use the toilet a lot more, or, they're starting to suck their thumbs, because sometimes anxiety does manifest in the form of sensory difficulties as well. So they're seeking that comfort, and how it presents is, they suddenly started to suck their thumbs, or they suddenly started to engage in some sort of a behavior which is more sensory based. And that's where we need to identify whether it's a sensory need or it's related to stress or trauma. So that's another area.
Interesting.
And then we talk about also social anxiety. So, children don't want to go out anymore. They don't want to engage in social interactions. They're, again, very withdrawn. Things that they used to perform really well at are seeming to be difficult, challenging. They're not performing up to their abilities or their potential. Their self-esteem levels are being affected. So, and that is something that can be affected with past failure as well. So their self-esteem levels are being affected in case they have undergone failure and they don't know how to manage it, and they don't have the right support in managing any sort of a failure, be it at school or at a social event or anything that is competitive. And for example, they lose and they're not able to deal with it. That can also manifest in the way of trauma or stressful environments. And I would say meltdowns as well, because we often confuse between tantrums and meltdowns.
That's interesting because, when you hear, the terrible twos, this is the way that they express themselves. They're very normal to have these type of meltdowns. But how do you know? Again, lucky. My son's been quite good to me so far, but I didn't really get the terrible two phase. Obviously, yes, there's times where he's stubborn. And when he wants to do something. But then, for other parents, is it normal? Is it a trigger of something else? How do you know the difference?
So I would say that if it's indicative of something worrying is when you monitor the meltdowns.
Okay.
So you have to see what the meltdown looks like on the outside. So how long is the meltdown occurring for? And what is the frequency and intensity of the meltdowns?
Okay.
So these are the two terms that we have to really be mindful of.
Yeah.
And we need to track this.
Yeah.
So yes, 1 off, 2 off, 3 off even within a week is fine. Because even when children, as they are growing up and they find difficulties in adapting to newer routines or different things in life, they could have a meltdown.
Okay.
But we have to see how long they're occurring for.
Got it.
And there could be bouts of excessive crying or just flopping on the floor and complaining of somatization. For example, saying that I have a stomach ache. Although if you take them to a doctor, there might not be a plausible cause for it. So, that's something that we need to look out for. Somatization is a term that we use as psychologists, that we need to understand that why the child is presenting with this concern, although there is no physiological explanation to it. And that is, again, a precursor of stress. Chronic stress or trauma that they have experienced. A lot of times, you would see cases of bullying. And they happen over time. It's not something that happens on a day and the child comes to you and cries and you're able to identify it. It's a complex process and it involves multiple agencies and stakeholders. So you need to investigate it further. So bullying is something that can cause somatization. The child would just not want to go to school. They would complain of headache, stomach ache, or, I'm just not feeling well, I have pains and aches, and they would make any sort of excuses just to safeguard themselves. And we need to understand that it's a self-protective act for the child. They're not doing it intentionally, and that's something that as parents, we need to understand. And also, I would like to point out this term called internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So the way to see it is that if a child is going through difficult times, which is either categorized as stress or trauma, they might externalize behavior.
What would that look like then?
And that would look like something that could have aggressive tendencies, that could have language that the child was not using before but now seems foul, seems inappropriate. So these are all externalizing behavior that you would see from a child. So in my experience, what I would have seen is that suddenly a child is coming to school hitting their peers, kicking their teachers, throwing things, being really aggressive and violent, screaming, and, destroying property. And this was not how the child is typically behaving in a normal school life. So that is something to look out for, that if there is these kind of externalizing behavior symptoms that the child is showing, we'll have to dig in further and try to understand what the underlying cause is. And on the opposite side of this, we have internalizing behaviors, and that is linked to childhood depression. A term that we don't really come across.
I've never heard that. That's why it's my reaction. I didn't even know that was a thing.
And that is very, very much prevalent. And just like how adults go through clinical depression, children can also go through clinical depression. And there are specific standardized assessments that we use to measure that, to understand it accurately and have precision interventions for it as well. And that's the kind of children who will internalize everything. So, they'll take it all in. And the way it will manifest is, like I was earlier mentioning, social withdrawals, somatization, having a change in their temperament, unable to engage in daily activities. Their day-to-day functioning is impacted because they're internalizing all of that stress and they don't have the right channels to express and navigate through these difficult emotions.
There's so much to this. Like I'm literally I'm so quiet because I'm absorbing so much of this information. I think it's just helpful to understand this. And again, because we're not taught it, to be honest. I mean, parenting, we don't really get to go into the kind of emotional development and how you support your child emotionally and intentionally. Just learning about it. Just not saying because my child is traumatized or he's, acting out, as they would say. But if there was that case, at least now I can be a bit more well informed to say maybe it's because of this or I'm noticing this. But you don't get taught that, particularly again in our culture. All of this would be like, what? or the kid is just seen as a naughty child, basically,
Yes.
if they're doing these types of behaviors. So another thing that reminded me of how smart these children are. And we talk about the age of 3, I think, is probably the most important start of their emotional development. I always remember, my son still does this now, and maybe it wasn't a good thing, but I was always intentional of obviously going through divorce, navigating that. I'd never wanted to cry in front of him. It was something that I just didn't want him to see me in that way. And he's very connected to me. So he feels when I feel. That's one thing I'm sure of.
Yeah.
So we could be playing, we're laughing. I made sure that the environment was very light and it felt very happy, I guess, in a time. But he would just be like, Mummy, are you happy? Are you happy, Mummy? And it would just, it's still, to this day, I'm like, yeah, I'm happy. We're laughing. I'm not crying. I'm not, I'm very engaged in playing with him. But it's just like he just feels, he feels everything around him. And that was one of the reasons why, as many people would say, he's young, he's fine, his dad is not in the house, he'll adapt. My son feels everything. For him to continuously ask me that at times where I was actually very happy and fine. So I think that's important to actually make aware that these small beings that are growing to become adults, I think from a very young age, they're very emotionally aware. And that's why I wanted to be very intentional with allowing him to express himself.
Yeah, of course. And like you said, I think the first 5 to 7 years are the foundational stages to build that emotional capacities. So I think that is the key area key stage, where you could really build on the emotional development of children, support them. And like you said, children are very receptive to your emotions.
They are.
And they're always soaking in your emotions. They're tapping onto your emotional energy as well.
It's insane.
And like you said, you have experienced it yourself, that even though, you might have felt sad, but you didn't want to show him so that it would, just to protect him so that he doesn't feel
So he doesn't feel sad, basically,
But he was still able to tap onto your emotional energy, because as primary caregivers, and especially as mothers, you have that connection, you have that bond. That parental bond is extremely important. And even within their bodies and even within their brain architecture, I would say there's a lot happening. So, their frontal lobe is still getting developed. Their limbic system, the brain structure, we call it the amygdala, which is responsible for your emotional connectedness, which is responsible to how you receive, how you process, and how you interpret different emotions. They're all at a very formative stage during childhood. So any sort of a traumatic event can really have an impact on your brain architecture. And I'm not saying that children should always stay away from these experiences. It's life. We're not in control of the kind of experiences that are going to be thrown at us, at our children, at anybody. Life is unpredictable. So I think, so as caregivers, one thing that we need to take note of is to show and express emotions.
Yes, this is what my therapist keeps on saying, because I'm the type, I suppress emotions. I go into, if something traumatic happens, I just go into survival and forget about it, you'll be fine. This was a season where I found it very difficult. And I think to even make me a better person in terms of being more emotional, learning to be more vulnerable, I'm having to definitely unravel and unwrap in a very uncomfortable way, because I hate doing that stuff. But then equally, I want my son to feel like he is very balanced. He can share his emotions, he can control his emotions, he can be vulnerable in a safe place. But I'm working on trying to do that for myself. So I think my therapist was like, it's okay to be sad. Obviously not for too long in front of your son, but it's okay to say, if you're sad, where I would just be like, no, we have to all be happy, and it has to be happy. And I don't ever want him to see me cry, is what I always said. So I think that's also important as well.
Yeah, it's very important. I think another major factor that we need to think about is the emotional health of parents, of caregivers. Because if we're not emotionally resilient or prepared, then we're not going to be able to be better equipped to parent our children. And a lot of times this gets ignored. Because parents often ignore their needs obviously not intentionally, but just to be better providers for their children.
Yeah.
But again, that is something that you have to bring into your awareness and do it consciously. Even for me as a psychologist, I go for therapy because if I don't do that and I go through a traumatic experience, and if I don't deal with it in an effective manner, I will not be in a position to offer those services to my clients, to my, to the children I work with, to the parents that I train, because this is something that gets stuck not just in our brain, but also in our body, and also, in different parts of our consciousness. And some psychologists are now trying to go towards the spiritual realms of it, because psychology as a discipline is so broad. And now, we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about spiritual healing, and we're talking about alternative approaches to traumatic experiences in life, and bioenergetic healings. And I think they are all complementary methods. So anything that you adopt as a parent, just as an outlet for your emotional health, so that you feel that, okay, I am better prepared to have a supportive environment, or build that supportive environment for my child, is very, very important. Just like how you would nourish yourself with food and water and exercise, for example, you need to do that for your emotional and mental health as well, because the more you ignore it, the more it's going to be repressed and suppressed, and it will come out in maladaptive ways later on. So you might become irritable as a parent. You might have a lower threshold of patience. You might, snap at your child quickly. You might not have the ability to listen attentively. You might not be mindful in the moment. You might not have that awareness around, your child's needs. So there's, it's a ripple effect.
It's so true.
It's very important to have, those self-care rituals, or have that time even away from your children for some time in the day or in the week, where you have that time to just recalibrate with your mental health, and have that, that time away just to sort of sit with yourself, ground, and be better prepared. So I think as caregivers, it's very, very important for you to be fit mentally and emotionally, so that you can offer that environment.
I'm a big believer of that. And like I said, 36 going on 37, I've never invested in myself more than I have now. And I think when you go through traumatic experiences, hopefully you use it for purpose and for learning. And I think for me, because I am that way as a mother, whatever I'm doing, and I know kids mirror. I mean, I'm seeing that in this little being,
They're
my
little
son.
monkeys.
They mirror everything. So as soon as I found out about what was happening in my marriage, I started therapy. I needed to be healthy enough to be able to raise my son. And that was probably the only motivation. I want to be able to shed and, be the healthiest I can mentally, in order to make sure that I'm raising a boy that turns into a man that's very comfortable with his emotions, knows how to express himself, can be vulnerable. So I'm working on myself to help him, because that's so important, because they copy everything, they absorb everything. So this is one of my motivations for sure.
No, I'm definitely very appreciable of you as a parent, that you have.
I'm trying. Let me just throw it out there. But I'm aware. I'm fully aware. Because I don't think you can ignore these types of things. And you want to obviously raise your kid to be the most balanced and healthiest person they can be. So your skill sets help that so much.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think the comment that you made about being able to provide for your son, there was some research recently which talks about how having a good emotional health can impact your cognitive levels as well. So, we might ignore it for a while, thinking that it's not important. But what happens over time is that you become cognitively impaired, because, you start to forget things. You have memory problems, you have decision-making problems, you are a poor judge of things that you do in your daily life. And that then affects your higher order cognitive functioning skills. So everything is, again, linked.
My
because,
gosh. There's so much to this.
Yeah.
Why do they not teach this more, I think?
But Sharon, interestingly, now there are a lot of curriculums that are shaped around emotional literacy. And even if they are not taught in school, a lot of parents are taking initiative where, they get in touch with professionals who are involved with such kind of work.
Okay.
And they're using that emotional literacy just to
fantastic.
educate themselves, to work with their children, and to have that emotional vocabulary, like we say,
Yeah, this is it.
imparted to our children, because it's very, very important. And like you mentioned, you're fortunate enough that your child is expressive. He's able to articulate his feelings. And that is not something that a lot of children are able to do. So as adults, we have to give them that language. We have to probably sometimes offer a lot more support in terms of, so how I do it is I use a variety of resources. So, I would use audio, visuals, I would use, sensory-based resources, just so that the child is in a curious and explorative state. And I can then have it structured in a way where it's child-led. And at the same time, I'm giving that opportunity to the child to learn about emotions and feelings and how it's okay to express these difficult emotions. So it's very important, and it's very much linked to your higher cognitive functioning. And like we say, IQ, EQ, I think with the modern world, there is importance that is given to EQ, and rightly so.
Anuja? This is so fascinating. I haven't even scratched the surface about reading about this. At night, sometimes I'll just Google just to learn. I mean, like I said, I'm very thankful that my son is, he's very communicative. He's happy. He's thriving. He has adapted to our new norm very well. But I just wanted to know, how, just be more observant, be more intentional. I think when it's with children's emotions, we dismiss them very easily and we try and shape them in what we want them to be, which is fine. Obviously, there has to be guidance. This has been fantastic. I've learned so much.
Oh, you have? I'm glad.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing all of this knowledge. I have taken so much away. And it's also given me some reassurance that, maybe I feel like my approaches are a good thing of how I'm trying my best for my son and how I communicate with him. So that's left me very happy. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Excellent. Thanks. Let's Talk DXB. Real conversations by real people.